Hi, this is Paul. Yesterday, well, I'm recording this on a Monday. I'll probably post it on a Tuesday. I appeared on the famous Adam and Sitch very long live stream on Sunday afternoons. I'm usually pretty tired by Sunday afternoons after working all Sunday morning doing the kinds of work I do. But I was on their live stream and I wasn't exactly sure what we were going to talk about. I knew it would have something to do with religion. Basically, Adam had said something to Sitch about the ancient peoples thinking in different ways, believing in different ways about the mythology, the stories of the gods, than people do today. And I tried to answer that question in the context. I don't know that I necessarily did a very good job, so I thought I would actually make a video on this today because it's a question that interests me a lot. In many ways, it's a question I first ran into when I was in Calvin Seminary, looking at the synoptic problem. Well, what's the synoptic problem? There's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they're called the Synoptic Gospels because it seems pretty evident. I've got a little book here that it seems pretty evident. Well, here's this book. It seems pretty evident that they were working from the same source. A lot believe that Mark is the source, and Matthew and Luke says that he used sources. Matthew and Luke take stuff from Mark's gospel, add other information, some of which they had in common, which began to be called Q, and put that into their own gospel accounts. Now, and especially when you add the Gospel of John, you begin looking at details of these stories, and sometimes they tend to diverge. And this causes a lot of people anxiety with respect to, well, what's the real story? This isn't an issue that's alone to the Gospels. You can find the same story where you have Kings and Chronicles in the Old Testament, which tell parallel stories, multiple accounts of the same story in many different ways. And there was in the modern period, also in the ancient period too, we shouldn't fail to recognize that. In the ancient period, but especially in the modern period, people tried to harmonize these Gospels. And the church always rejected that, leaving them as four witnesses. Well, and some of these differences, how many angels were there at the tomb, what day was Jesus crucified? I mean, some of these differences are not small. And by the time I got to seminary in the 80s, these ideas were around. My New Testament prof at a fairly conservative institution like Calvin Theological Seminary in Grand Rapids, Michigan, basically said that the attempt to harmonize these Gospels is not the way to go. You're better off understanding that the different authors had different points that they were trying to make, and just leave it at that, instead of always trying to harmonize them and concoct one fifth story that makes the other four stories make sense. And if you go to New Testament debating channels, you can find these kinds of things debated and back and forth and back and forth. One of the things that eventually arises is the question of whether ancient peoples conceptualized history in the same way we do. That's a fair question. And the point I made on the podcast was people in the ancient world understood things like basic cause and effect, that sexual intercourse leads to pregnancy, which makes the claim of the virgin birth of Jesus noteworthy, not because ancient peoples didn't understand causality, but because it truly was exceptional. Now, in the last 2.5 years, after studying a lot of Jordan Peterson, cognitive science with John Vervaeke, and a bunch of other things, it's quite clear that both our perceptual apparatus and our representational tools are very deeply placed within our culture. Now, we're having a heat wave in Sacramento, and this computer does have a fan, so if you hear the fan whirl up to try and keep the computer cool while I'm talking in my office, which is 87 degrees right now, not terribly uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable at all, really, but getting warm. So the question that Adam and Sitch are wrestling with is an important question, and it's a very real question. And my answer to the question is really yes and no. Now, I use the example of Stephen Smith. I've been watching some of his videos, and I ordered a copy of one of his books recently. He first showed up in a video that I'll reference later in this video with Ross Douthat and Tara Isabel Burton on the American Enterprise Institute, a video that I used before, and I re-listened to it recently, and I re-listened to Stephen Smith's presentation in that video, and that drew me into some of his other, basically his other thesis about secularization, because he got some very interesting ideas about that really do impinge on my God number one, God number two theory, what is secularization, and some of that, so I hope to make some videos about that. But in the process of presenting, now he's a constitutional law scholar at the University of San Diego. And some of the things that he's dealing with are, he notes, for example, the fact that if you read the ancient Greeks, and this is a point I made yesterday in my video with my stream with Sitch and Adam, is that you very much find Greeks in at least three camps. Sort of the philosophical Greeks who might say of the gods, well, you know, they're made up stories, okay? They're stories of the poets, but we don't really imagine they're there. Now, the degree to which we are being fair to them is difficult. If you go back to my conversation with Mark Vernon, now if you remember Mark Vernon, he wrote this book about Owen Barfield, Secret History of Christianity. We had to talk about that, and part of what, after Vernon had gotten his PhD in Plato, he read Barfield and became convinced that when we read Plato, we're not just thinking thoughts behind him like him, that we can't help but have our thoughts deeply determined by the history of thought that came between us and Plato. So whether or not we're getting these philosophical Greeks right with respect to what they believed in is a remarkably difficult question. But Stephen Smith notes rather quickly in the video that there are philosophical Greeks who are mostly philosophers, and we have their writings. And did Plato really believe in the gods, or, you know, Plato's forms are sort of godlike things, or were they? And then there's mythological Greeks that were the poets that had all of these stories about the gods. And then let's say there were cultic Greeks who were performing rites and sacrifices. And now again, whether or not we would consider these people religious, we can go back to the conversation about Tom Holland and everything going on in that conversation. But we do know that the Greeks talked about this. For example, a few years ago when I was reading Dallas Willard's The Divine Conspiracy, and he was making his point about Jesus talking about dikaiosune in Plato's Republic, I decided to pick up a copy of Plato's Republic in Greek, and I was reading it in Greek and English, and I began to notice where in Plato's Republic you have the gods, and we understood what the Greeks understood about the gods, but every now and then you have God in the singular. And it's like, what are these two things that they're talking about here? What did Plato believe when it came to God or the gods? And part of the reason we use Plato is that he wrote quite a bit, and he's been studied enormously. Aristotle likewise had ideas about God, and if you do any kind of philosophical work and you study Plato and Aristotle, they sort of have different conceptions of God. Remember, one points up, the other points down. But what did they think about these stories? Did they think there, and again, watch our language, really was a Zeus? How are we to think about that? And to what degree can we know whether or not they believed in such gods? And again, these are real conversations that the ancient Greeks had as well. We have textual evidence of what we would call a secularity on this topic on the part of some. You have the Stoics, you have the Epicureans, and many of these philosophers didn't seem to, necessarily want to go to the temple to offer sacrifices to a deity in order to procure something in the world. Now, in many ways, we're bumping into the debates between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, because one way to understand where that conflict arose was that Sam Harris was a little disturbed and suspicious that whereas in Sam's mind, such behavior, such as maybe not going to a Greek temple, but going to an American church to pray to God for your job or your marriage or the health of your child or something like this, very God number two like, would be, well, this is a silly idea, this is superstitious, you shouldn't waste your time doing that. But then Jordan Peterson comes around with God number one and very much says, you know, this idea of God is actually rather indispensable in terms of our social psychology. And because of my conversations with Adam in the past, I know this is an idea that he's very well acquainted with and in fact appreciates, even though Adam is himself an atheist. He doesn't believe God is real. But again, we have to watch our language here, because what do you mean by real? And Jordan Peterson would say, well, he's real enough, at least as an idea, to impact human procreation, to impact human behavior, and therefore, whether or not you believe that there's a man in the sky, now again, we're watching our representations here, because we've got other issues that we've been talking about all along the way. The idea of God is real enough to deeply shape human history. And in fact, if you're in Sam Harris's camp, part of you has to concede that, because if the idea of God wasn't real enough to shape human history, then there's no value in attempting to exercise that idea from history moving forward in pursuit of Sam Harris's vision of a rational world in which supernaturality is banned, etc., etc. Now, part of why this is so difficult to talk about is that we have to look at language and history. And I set out an example for them. I said, you know, what if was it literally true that Uncle Sam strode across the Pacific and beat the Japanese Empire to a pulp after the bombing of Pearl Harbor? And of course Sitch was saying, well, Uncle Sam is sort of a, he didn't use these words, but it's sort of a artistic, or let's say even mythological representation of the United States government. Okay, well, let me ask you this question. Is it literally true that the United States sailed across the Pacific in World War II and beat the Japanese Empire to a pulp? Is that literally true? I bet you a lot of you would say, yes, that's literally true. But compare the two statements. Did the U.S. Navy really sail across the Pacific? Well, by that point, they're using modern warships. They're not using sailing ships, but still we use that word sail. Well, I know what you mean by sail, and I really meant traveled. But even when you look at the difference between United States government and Uncle Sam, why does United States government feel more literal than Uncle Sam? Because the mental construct of the United States government is just as much a mental construct as Uncle Sam. Now, Uncle Sam would be more mythological. Uncle Sam is more picturesque. Uncle Sam has more personification. But you can't point to the United States government, can you? What is the United States government besides an idea? There is, depending on how you understand the word literal or material, is there a material United States government the way there's a material Paul Vanderklay? Well, right away, these questions get complex. Now, we might ask, and I asked this question to them, did Abraham Lincoln free the slaves? Well, at some point, you're going to have to ask, what do you mean by freeing the slaves? Which means that at what point you're going to ask, what is slavery? Is slavery a shackle on an arm? And so freeing the slaves is opening that shackle? Shackles were opened by many overseers and slave owners, and slaves were never freed. What does it mean to free the slaves? Well, slavery is a legal definition. Is that how we're going to define slavery? Or is slavery the instantiation of beatings, limitations of escape, deprival of human freedom, etc., etc.? What is, in fact, the law, but maybe a broad intersubjective idea? And so very quickly, if you look at language and you're trying to use this word literal, if I start pressing you on some of these facts, you discover very quickly that, well, what do we mean by literal? It gets fuzzy very quickly. So then very quickly, usually people want to wade in with the word scientific. Is it scientifically true that Lincoln freed the slaves? Well, that word doesn't help us really at all. See, we sort of use science, the word science, as a metaphor for some sort of correspondence theory about language and arrangements of matter. And when I say matter, I mean the stuff in the world, of matter in history. So in what way did Lincoln free the slaves? Did Lincoln free the slaves in a way that John Brown did not? Well, yeah. The Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln actually doesn't free any slaves. Well, what do you mean by that? He only freed the slaves in states that had already rebelled from the United States. And those slaves in the border states remained slaves. In fact, really, slavery persisted until an amendment to the Constitution. But you'll notice very quickly that, well, literally, Lincoln freed the slaves literally. Again, do you mean he came and unshackled someone? Or did he move pen across paper? He literally moved pen across paper. Okay, but what does it mean? And so you very quickly find out that with these large conceptual sentences or ideas that we're using, literal and scientific break down pretty quickly. You have to understand that you can't appropriate ideas of these arrangements of matter, material, without huge metaphorical constructs like Uncle Sam or the United States government. Now, well, let's try adding some science. Let's say I say the sentence, I went to the lab yesterday and made oxygen and hydrogen out of water using electricity. Well, that sounds very science-y. Sounds very much like chemistry lab where you can take water and through electrolysis release hydrogen and oxygen. And many of you probably did that in your high school chemistry lab. Sounds very science-y, but it's historically untrue. Why? Because I don't own a lab. And I did know hydrolysis yesterday. I came and preached. And say, well, math is scientifically true. Well, that language doesn't really work either. Is 1 + 1 = 2? I mean, that's one of the first. Once you get the idea of addition, well, then that's true. But, well, let's run a little story problem, shall we? One event, going to the lab, plus another event, electrolysis, equals two things, hydrogen and water. Hydrogen and oxygen should be. And you'd say, well, that's no fair because you're not comparing like 1 apple plus 1 apple equals 2 apples. Well, fair enough. But right away that you see that this representation of 1 + 1 = 2 actually has to correspond to something if it's going to work in this very certain way you're used to thinking about 1 + 1 = 2. And I would argue that because the idea is so simple and the mathematical equation is so simple, most of the time you even use that as a metaphor for something more like certainty or obviousness or a conclusion you see and know directly. Now, I could say, I went to church and beat the pulp out of Satan's kingdom yesterday. Is that historically true? Well, is it more historically true than I went to the lab and produced hydrogen and oxygen out of water yesterday? Well, he said, well, you're using figurative language. Now, I could say, I went to the church, preached a sermon, had a few meetings, and appeared on a live stream yesterday. He said, well, that's literally true. Well, is it more literally true than I went to church and beat the pulp out of Satan's kingdom yesterday? If I say it in Spanish, does that depend on its literality? Because even when I say I went to church, a theologian might argue you can't go to church, you can participate in church. Well, I went to the church building, and see very quickly right away, and this is of course where lawyers get their work, get that language more and more specific in terms of, well, what are we correlating things with? What is the correspondence that we are attempting to communicate through this use of language? But in almost every case, the language that we conventionally use, the vernacular, tends to be pretty sloppy. And if we want to get more and more defined, well, it very quickly gets very cumbersome. Is it historically true that I went to church and beat the pulp out of Satan's kingdom yesterday? Which would be admissible in court? If I were to say one from the stand and the other, the lawyer would probably back me up. Did you go to the building at 1390 Florin Road? Yes. Did you preach a sermon there? Yes. Did you talk to people there? Yes. Did you do other things on the internet there? Well, let's see, we streamed our sermon, and then I participated in a live stream with PSA and Sitch, or PSA Sitch and Adam Friended. What is the philosophical assumptions and cultural context for using language in court? Well, there is a context. That's my point. Now, what about the realm of science? Science involves obtaining knowledge by reducing variables, usually in presumed cause and effect relationships, reducing variables used in reproducible sequences. Okay, so the reproducibility is really important in science, and we usually find these little reproducible things, and then we try to scale up from them. The difficulty is that history doesn't work that way. And when I said realm of science, most of you didn't balk a bit. That word realm comes from what? Well, kingdom, sort of, isn't it? Is science a realm, or is the scientific process something that we do? Jordan Peterson quite famously said, most people don't think scientifically, and he was right, but we sure use the word science because in many ways science has become a defeater word, because in our culture, once you say we know this by science, then, well, it's sort of, court over. We know it by science, but usually if you press people, please tell me of the science that you know this by. And if you really start to press them in terms of what is the evidence, what is the chain of evidence, how does this particular group of cause and effect sequences actually relate to these other ones in history? And that usually works unless you start to look at whole ranges of things that we simply don't look at because they're not accessible to this method. Yet historians, especially since the scientific era, are all about looking for patterns, cause and effect patterns, and working scientifically, trying to reduce variables, even though with history that's tremendously hard because history is so completely replete with variables, for some correspondence theory of language. So really, we use science as a metaphor and don't even know it. So let's talk about historical truth, shall we? And here we're thinking about some correspondence things where if we had a video camera, why do we use the video camera illustration? Because there's some at least limited reproducibility, although again, we're doing this imaginatively because if we really had a video camera there, well, we'd be looking at the videotape. And in instances when we actually have a video camera there are far more questions we have like, what was the intent of that person? The video camera doesn't show that. If you look at the George Floyd video, is the police officer a racist? Well, you might look at racist behavior. You might talk about racist motivation, but unless someone is, let's say, sporting a racist symbol, can you just see racism? Do we have our race-dar, like our gaydar, and all these other ways that we just say, well, I just know it? Well, sometimes we sort of do, but is this scientific? Is that really the right way to use it? So I could say, I made beer yesterday in my microbrewery, or I went to work yesterday. Well, I don't have a microbrewery, and I'm not a beer maker. So if I would go to a court of law and say, I made beer yesterday in my microbrewery, they would say that's not true. Why? because I don't have a brewery and I don't make beer. I went to work yesterday. Yeah, I went to church. That they would say, okay, that's admissible because work is my job here at the church, so on and so forth. I'm a preacher and I went to church yesterday and I preached a sermon. We talk about historically true and false, and for the most part, a lot of the language is good enough so that we can understand what we mean by these sentences. But now let's get back to PSA Sitch's question. Would a Greek peasant really believe they could travel to Mount Olympus and find Zeus? Now here again, this question, at least on the surface, seems to suggest that, well, but now pay attention to what we're doing. I have this little story in my head that, okay, I'm in the United States. I'd have to travel all the way to Greek and have to ask whether the Mount Olympus that they were talking about and thinking about is the same as the Mount Olympus that you can find on Google Maps right now in Greece. So we'd have to have that conversation. But the idea is that, well, you have this Greek peasant that is praying to Zeus. So a cultic believer, okay, they're praying to Zeus. They're performing sacrifices for Zeus. And when their enemies are leaning down on them, oh, Zeus, great God of thunder, come and help me and rescue me from my adversaries, okay? And maybe they survived the battle, and afterwards they said, Zeus helped me and saved me in my day of trauma. Okay, I am going to go to Mount Olympus and shake hands. Okay, now wait a minute. Is Zeus the kind of thing that you can shake hands with? Can you shake hands with Uncle Sam? Well, what do you mean by Uncle Sam? Well, if you shake hands with a mayor or a governor or a senator or a president of the United States, are you shaking hands with Uncle Sam? Well, are they acting as an official representative of the United States? Maybe an ambassador. When you go to the embassy, are you looking for Uncle Sam? And you know, people would say, no, you're still fudging here. You're still cheating because, oh, so in other words, you're saying that Zeus is available to you in the way that Paul Vanderklay is available to you. Well, that a lot depends on what you imagine Zeus is. And because you're imagining he's a god, already the rules are differently. And so, are there the types of beings that have the kind of power and possibility that Zeus has? Well, okay, so that's sort of the question we're working. And really in the back of our minds, we're asking, what is really going on in our head when we're telling these stories and talking about these characters? Is it like talking about Thor and Captain America and Hulk and Iron Man? Well, we don't really believe that these people are available to us, and because Stan Lee or whoever came up with them, Thor of course, an ancient god, came up with them and draw them, what are their realities? What's the reality of Harry Potter? Is Harry Potter real? Now someone might say, Harry Potter inspired me to be a better person. So Harry Potter was real enough. But you say, but you don't really believe Harry Potter is walking around the world like Paul Vanderklay or Adam Friended is walking around the world. Do you? No, I don't believe that. Oh, okay. But yet Harry Potter inspired me to be a better person. So then what is Harry Potter? Well, he's a character, yeah. But these stories are real enough to change your story. And this is, those of you who listen to my channel quite a bit know, well, what exactly is a human being? Because on one hand, I'm this Homo sapien surrounded by skin who moves air, and both when I walk through a room and when I push it through my lungs to make the sound that you're hearing right now. But in another way, Plato is still around because his ideas are still talked about. Socrates is still around via Plato. Aristotle is still around. Jesus is still around. Well, that one gets really complicated. Muhammad and many people who are dead are still around. Well, they're around in a different way, yeah, but how real are they? Well, This is why you put up statues, because when you put up a statue, you make them more real. And I talked about how in the ancient world, well, even in the modern world, Saddam Hussein put up statues all over the place. Why? Did he put up statues for no reason at all? No, he put up statues for real reasons. Why? Because those statues had an effect on people. They changed the culture. They changed the spiritual realm. Well, what do I mean by that? This when we use this word spiritual, we use it in a way that there's this realm out there that is shaping the matter of the material world in such a way that human history is not the same. Statues do that. Why do you think we're pulling down statues? Why do you think we're putting up statues? Why do you think we're having all of these debates about history and images and representations? One of the interesting points that Stephen Smith makes is that what really creates the Roman Empire is the symbolism. And the same with Christianity when it comes to the fore, the symbolism. And the same in the United States. Remember, he's a constitutional lawyer, and so he gets involved in questions of church and state, or religion and state, and to what degree. And so I'll put the links to those videos. They're well worth watching. And I'm doing this video because I had the conversation yesterday, but those videos are candidates for upcoming videos because they're really good. They're really good videos, and they're very thought-provoking. And not only do they touch on contemporary issues, but they also very much can touch on these questions of what is real. How real is Zeus? How real is the God of the Bible? Well, real enough to change all of human history. Is that insufficiently real? That's more real than almost all of the 8 billion people alive on the planet today. Only the tiniest fraction of whom will be remembered by the next generation of human beings 100 years from now. Which is more real, those 8 billion people, or maybe it's the accumulation of those 8 billion people and what they're going to do in the world? You see, when you get to this question of reality and you really start pressing the questions, it gets interesting. So we touched on this question already a little bit when we started the video. The philosopher had a category of myth, but does the shepherd, does the peasant? And if you don't have the category of myth, but you just have the story that you live into, up in Nevada City there was a protest against Black Lives Matter. Why? Well, I love my country. Well, why did you think these other people don't? And isn't what's at debate actually what is the country? Is it the 1619 Project? Is it the Honest Abe and George Washington who cut down the cherry tree? Which story is actually governing in the world? Now, most of us will agree that Abraham Lincoln was a man, and George Washington was a man, and John Brown was a man, and Harriet Tubman was a woman. But these myths are in fact what shape countries and lead people to protest in the streets one way or another, or to go and die on a foreign battlefield for their country, or to go into quote-unquote national service because they love their country. And when that flag goes up, either you put your hand on your heart or you take a knee. What's going on with these symbols? So the philosopher had a category of myth that some individuals would have and others, including children, would not have. But yet one would say, well, mythology is still bending their reality to the degree that it's changing their behavior in a substantive, significant way, sometimes even unto death. So then let's use the example of Santa Claus. Now, it's really interesting because many of you, now watch the language, used to believe in Santa Claus. Okay. And this is where Jordan Peterson and his believing in God comes into the mix because, well, what exactly do you mean by believe? Well, children are a special case in this discussion because on one hand, our expectations of them are lower because we understand that there's a developmental curve that we grow into our capacity as adults. We also understand that there's diversity within human beings and our capacity for different kinds of thinking. And there's cultural differences in there too. Once certain ideas are so powerful that once we've had them, we can't unhave them. And they very much impact this whole strange experience of believing. So since all of you once were children, and most of you should be able to remember something of your childhood, did you believe in Santa Claus? Now, some of you will say yes, and some of you will say no. And you will probably say this on the basis of, see, I never believed in Santa Claus because my father didn't like the Santa Claus myth. And so he kept calling him the big fat phony. And my parents always they never hid the fact that they bought presents for us as a kids, and Grandpa and Grandma bought presents, and the presents on the tree, under the tree, were from our parents. And so I never believed in Santa Claus, but I always sort of wondered. And if I was up really late on Christmas Eve because I was watching Santa Claus is Coming to Town and Santa's in the mall, and so you look at the Santas, but we never went and sat on Santa's lap because, again, this was a mythology that my parents did not indulge in. They, in some ways, saw it as a rather, my father particularly, saw it as a rather consumeristic pagan cult rather than good Protestants who believed that Christmas was about Jesus Christ and his birth. But we did have a Christmas tree and we did have presents. And for that, I'm thankful. I like the Christmas tree. I like the presents. I was a little fascinated by Santa Claus. And like I said, some dark Christmas Eve nights, I would sit there and I would think about, could Santa really get to all these places at once? And then in our house in New Jersey, we didn't have a fireplace. I knew full well that the chimney went down to the furnace in the basement, and I thought, boy, you know, if he can fit down there, he's going to be in a world of trouble in that gas add-on onto that old steam coal-burning furnace that was in my house and that I grew up in. And I remember Voth. My conversation with Voth, that was something that Voth thought about. He was early on quite skeptical about the Santa Claus myth. Do you believe a fat man came down the chimney? Do you believe a fat man came down the chimney and brought you presents? Presents, Presents, not CE. Sorry for the typo in the slide. Did he really? Well, I saw Mommy kissing Santa Claus underneath the mistletoe, and you set out cookies and milk. Did presents show up? Well, there are the presents, and, you know, little kids go to bed early, and so you wake up in the morning and whoo, there they are. Were your parents Santa Claus? Could you find one at the mall? Is Santa Claus real? Well, real enough to show up at the mall. And, you know, when Jonathan Peugeot plays these games with people, this is the point he makes. Is the guy at the mall not really Santa Claus? Well, when you say, no, the real Santa Claus lives at the North Pole, has flying reindeer, that's the real Santa Claus. And since the North Pole is just ice and there are no flying reindeer, the story isn't true. Okay, but what do you mean by true and real? That you can't lay hands on this Santa Claus. Remember Zeus? Well, now think back to when you were a child. Think about, if you can remember, what exactly your belief was. Now, some of you will say this belief was a very emotional, motivating, powerful thing in your life, and you fought with other children on the playground in middle elementary because they said Santa Claus wasn't real, and your parents would never lie to you, so you were willing to come to blows to defend Santa Claus. And then when you learned that the jig was up, you were crushed. Well, what did you learn? Well, I learned that my mom and dad bought presents and put them under the tree. So what all was baked into that believing in Santa Claus? So on that dark Christmas Eve, when I sat up in bed and thought about, is Santa Claus really out there? Was I believing? See, and this is where Jordan Peterson's point is really germane. Well, what do we mean by that? So, of course, Jordan Peterson goes to Lafayette College and says, whatever we talk comes out of our mouth. It's our actions that really show what we believe. Well, fair enough. But you'll notice that this belief is actually a rather elusive thing. It's sort of a snitch to try to capture. What were you referring to when you used that word believe when you were a child? Well, again, our children certainly believe in things. I've used the illustration before that when my children were small, I always kind of noted the developmental marker when they're real little and you say no to them, they kind of develop an instinct around it. But at some point when you say no to them, they look at you like you're a traitor. I trusted you. You fed me. You did all these things for me. And now you defy me? What do children believe, and how do they believe it? And what does their belief look like? And how does that relate to action? Do you remember what it was like to have the belief in Santa Claus? Probably you do, somewhat, but I would dare bet it was also rather inconsistent. That is for many of us. In fact, as adults, our beliefs are inconsistent. How do I know this? I'm a minister of the church. People say, I believe in Jesus, and they go out and they betray. Well, John Calvin in his commentary in the book of Daniel says, to the degree that you worry, you disbelieve God. Jesus commands not to worry. I see Christians in church worrying all the time. I could very easily stand up and say, you don't believe a thing. How dare you? I stood up in church and it said, I believe in God the Father, maker of heaven and earth. The Apostles' Creed, I believe it. Well, do you still worry? Well, what is this believing thing anyway? It's consequential because when people deconstruct and, let's say, give up their faith, say, I don't believe this anymore. And usually, the point that I've made many times in past, our beliefs are not subject to our volition, and that's a really good thing. Because if we're walking across the street, I don't believe that the light is red, and then we walk out and we get hit by a car. I believe that the light is red because seeing is believing to a degree, but sometimes it isn't. So this belief thing is enormously complex. And so now we're asking a question, did that Greek peasant really believe in Zeus? Oh my goodness. We're not even sure exactly if we're reading Plato, who wrote a lot. If we're believing Plato, who was studied enormously, second or third after Jesus or something like that, at least in the West, I don't know. But we're not even sure if we're thinking Plato's thoughts correctly after him. And we want to know what's on the mind of Greek peasants who wrote nothing, whose life we know almost nothing about, because we only know the elites who could read and write and the things that have left other historical artifacts. What are the consequences of that belief? How is that belief regarded by others? And this is where things get tricky, because we as human beings relate to other people based on their beliefs, because at least their profession of beliefs give us a degree of indication about what their behaviors will be in the future. A couple of days ago, I saw just Twitter was lighting up with a Pew study that, it's these white evangelicals that are going to vote for Trump. Oh, okay, fair enough. So you believe in Jesus, you vote for Trump. Now, a lot of Christians will back off that. No, it's only those white evangelicals. Okay, tell me about those evangelical beliefs. Well, I know lots of people who don't believe that way and voted for Trump, and I know people who do believe that way and won't vote for Trump. So what exactly are we talking about with all of this belief words? But yet at the same time, we are always judging each other on the basis of their beliefs, depending on their actions. Well, I don't believe masks stop anything, and I believe wearing a mask violates my constitutional right, so I'm going to fight the greeter at Costco to be let into Costco without a mask. Well, those beliefs are pertinent. I believe that, and then name some heinous thing that you're going to get in trouble with some group. I'm not going to name one, although my mind is filled with ideas that I could say. But too many of you would get triggered and you would close the video. Beliefs are important. We use them all the time. We use them in order to know each other, to relate to each other, especially in terms of what we can expect from each other. And this happened with children. They believe in Santa. Mommy, there's Santa. I need to go tell him my list. Okay, we'll wait in line here at this crazy line at the mall, and then you're going to get up on this guy's, and I hope he doesn't smell like alcohol. and you're going to tell him, and I'm going to over-listen so that I can have an idea of what to get you for Christmas. Because it would be awfully nice if he would foot the bill for those expensive Christmas presents, but he's a mall Santa, and who knows how much money he has anyway. I bet you're foggy going back and reimagining and living into that experience of belief. Well, it's because it was a long time ago. Yeah, but can you even, living into another human being, even into ourselves at a younger age? No one can do it like we can. It's foggy still. Why do we do so in such a facile way with others who believe in things that we don't, and we downgrade their status? Now we're getting to the rub. The kids on the playground. Do you still believe in Santa? Yes. Ha! I know it's a lie. You've been duped. Your parents are liars. They don't really love you except for the fact that they are buying the Christmas presents and they're feeding you this myth. Why? Because it's sort of a fun family secret and we all have a good laugh about it. But we older elementary kids are in on the secret knowledge, you little dupes. It's all about status, isn't it? This game impact of belief. You believe that the earth is flat. You believe that the Gulf of Tonkin, the Vietnamese shot first. You believe Han shot first. You believe Han would never do that. He'd only return fire. You believe Princess Leia is Luke Skywalker's sister. And that kiss, scandal. We play these status games with belief all the time because beliefs are actually pretty important in terms of how we gauge each other's behaviors. Now, this is the video I was talking about, and if you haven't watched it, it's well worth your time. They get to talking about witches. And at one point, somebody in the crowd makes the comment, there's an author, and I posted that on the blog, and I want to finish reading her article because it was really quite... Here's the article. It's by an Oxford scholar, she's originally from Australia, named Diane Purkis, Managing Our Darkest Hatreds and Fears, Witchcraft from the Middle Ages to Brett Kavanaugh. And it's the part that I read. I hadn't read all of it. It's really a terrific article. She goes on to, she's an expert in witches, and she goes to make the point, which basically someone else made the point in the question and answer period of that lecture, that, well, most of the witches that people refer to, they get popularized today as, well, maybe I should just read some of it. First, take a candle. Then pour some salt into your hand. Then, keeping the grains in your palm, take a pen to write out a thank you to Christine Blasey Ford, the woman whose allegations of sexual assault against Supreme Court nominee and now Justice Brett Kavanaugh stunned a nation. If you prefer, simply say, I believe you. This is just one of the many quasi-religious rituals circulating on the internet in the wake of the Kavanaugh confirmation to the Supreme Court. These rituals are said to help self-identify witches, process trauma, anger, and grief. In autumn 2018, a television schedule was full of witches, from pseudo-historical A Discovery of Witches to remakes of Charmed, and to the Netflix reboot Sabrina the Teenage Witch. A feminist who hexed her headmaster with a plague of spiders when he refused to act on the bullying of her non-binary best friend. The witches of 2018 are galvanized and political, says the London Times, which all sounds like a lovely extended Halloween party, but soon the reservations begin. We are the granddaughters of the witches who weren't able to burn, reads a sign in a 2017 Women's March. Yes, except that unless they were descended from German or French immigrants, they were actually descended from the witches that hadn't been hanged. The writers probably mean the Salem witches, though, which means they were mathematically challenged. It's an odd image to choose to empower young women. The spells, shows, and signs are pretending to a history that could be described as charitable, that could be described charitably as misunderstood, uncharitably as utter rubbish. In fairness to them, they are drawing on published books, albeit ones that have been overtaken by more recent works. Let me just change my screen here a little bit so I can read around the picture a little bit better. And they are very clearly picking and choosing. Yet as a historian, I am, shall we say, uncomfortable with the degree of falsification involved. A central aspect of witchcraft in this 21st century incarnation is its insistence on its own virtue, a virtue which it projects back into the past. Modern witches have no doubt that witches in the past, in times of persecution, were good too. Opponents of patriarchy, like themselves. Patriarchy here means Christianity in the sense of organized religion, and especially the Catholic Church, with its obvious discomfort with the body and human sexuality. Modern witches claim to be speaking for an entire class of oppressed people who have existed throughout history. Quote, "For decades, witches have been moving slowly out of the shadows, spreading good magic across the planet. The forces of capitalism, patriarchal greed, and white supremacy united for one last gasp, producing our present circumstance. Nazis in the streets, our Earth in peril, and an actual rapist in the White House. It's not great out there these days, but in 2018, we will fight for the change we deserve to see. In 2018, we will support progressive candidates, advocate for justice, and more importantly, vote witch." Isn't this interesting? In a way, this is indeed nothing new. Countercultural movements from the 1960s also sought, ironically, for magical powers, as when the yippies tried to levitate the Pentagon. Witchcraft was always practiced by people who were outliers, who were on the fringes, which Dakota Brachiali says. Those people oftentimes had to also be the arbiters of their own justice. This almost meaningless statement seems to claim impunity for launching magical attacks. They have been attacked, so it's fair to fight back. And I mentioned witchcraft, and Sitch said, well, he knows witches who really believe it. But again, it's kind of hard to know, what do you really believe? This argument depends on history. These exotic outsiders are framed as historical constants. However, the source quoted, even by such an august scholarly journal as Marie Claire, is Barbara Ehrenreit's long discredited idea that the majority of those accused were midwives and herbalists. Careful study of the witch trials, including studies by women historians such as Liddell Roper, have revealed that very few of the accused were midwives, and some historians have argued convincingly that the majority of midwives were most likely to be working with the persecutors against them. The popular idea that witches in the past were lonely souls living at odds with their ignorant Christian communities is just not true. There are, in fact, so many problems with modern witches' historical narrative that it's hard to know where to begin. But a good starting point might be the assumption that witches are at variance with their culture rather than a product of their culture. Those accused of witchcraft, including those who genuinely believe themselves to be practicing magic, a minority of those accused, espoused beliefs that derive directly from medieval Christendom. In this essay, I will show that medieval and early modern witchcraft was for the most part not a pagan practice, but a dissident form of Christianity. It will also argue that modern pagans and modern witches are themselves product of the very globalized, commercial, urban, and anywhere culture which they set out to resist. Because rather than reacting against those trends, they are turning what might once have been a genuinely radical alternative into another form of self-care. Finally, I will show that the surviving remnants of pagan culture illuminate a much more violent and less liberal world than the one imagined by modern witches. A number of publications in the last 10 years have focused on highly specific aspects of the medieval body, the classical understanding of sexuality, and a wide range of forms of magical thinking in the Middle Ages, including, and in particular, ideas about being called fairies. So we're looking at fairy culture. And it doesn't really have to do with sexuality so much. Think about Tolkien and fairies. Here, I want to attempt a synthesis of these strands. Many modern witches style themselves as goddess worshippers, but in medieval and early modern witchcraft spells, the Virgin Mary plays a much bigger role. She is referenced far more often than any goddess. The work of Claire Leconteau in traditional magical spells for protection and healing illustrates this perfectly. The vast majority of the examples of charms combine Christian prayers, a logic of extensible and sympathetic body, and ideas about the supernatural ministers that surround human beings. Examples of spells include the following: Lord Jesus Christ, Son of the living God, and the Blessed Virgin Mary, miraculously fertilized by the operation of the Holy Ghost, Logos, God, and flesh, we implore your mercy so that we may be delivered from any snare or evil spell of the devil, and give us the ability to engender, conceive, and nurture children for eternal life. Sounds practically like a prayer you're going to hear in a Roman Catholic church, or even in a Protestant church that isn't too hung up about the Virgin Mary. It's indistinguishable from prayer. It's a long article. I hope to remember to put the link in the notes, because it's very interesting stuff. So what did these witches actually believe? How can you tell? See, we have difficulty knowing what each other believes, even by listening to each other speak. I've used this illustration before. I've been married to my wife for 32 years, and just this morning we were having a conversation, and she was saying, I'm still trying to figure you out. We've been married for 32 years. We were going out 2 years before that. After 34 years, we're still mysteries to each other. Part of it because our ideas do change about some things over time, and you got to kind of keep up with it. Our grasp on this believing aspect of us is pretty shaky. It's good enough often, but not as open and shut as we imagine. And again, you can see this carefully if you watch religious communities. I should put that link in here a second so I don't forget. Now let's get back to the Greek peasant trying to find Zeus. And in the video, I made the point about Taylor Swift. Is Taylor Swift really Taylor Swift? You see these representations on passed-through handlers and marketers. Who is Taylor Swift? And Adam got that idea right away. Well, yeah, the Taylor Swift we look at and the Taylor Swift. Which is the real Taylor Swift? Well, the Taylor Swift that is propagandized via Netflix or the music industry or the media industry might outlive the Taylor Swift that is embodied in her flesh. Well, what about Zeus? Can you go and find Taylor Swift? Well, you might. If you show up at her mansion, and I assume she has one, you'll probably encounter a security guard, and you say, I want to go see Taylor Swift. And are you a fan? Are you a stalker? Why do you? I need to know if she's real. Yeah, she's real. Take my word for it. Here's a picture. Here's a signed autograph. Be on your way, thank you. No, I need to shake her hand. I need to touch her hair. I want to see if it's real or not. I want to touch her clothing. You might wind up in jail. Well, can you get well, then you're going to see her at a concert. Well, I mean, very quickly you discover that, well, I'm going to go to Mount Olympus and find Zeus. Can you go to her house like you can go to Mount Olympus? Well, might be able to find her house, but you're not going to get in. Right away, the complexities of this world begin to mount. Whereas we had this little story in our head, I'm going to trot up Mount Olympus, and hey, if there's no temple up there or throne room up there, then he's not really there. But what's built into this idea of this god? Because Zeus is a god, he's got powers that we don't have to make him available to us. Now, if you read C.S. Lewis's Till We Have Faces, C.S. Lewis plays with some of these ideas in his remaking of that myth in what's arguably his best novel. Taylor Swift has powers we don't have that make her unavailable to most of us too. Well, what about the Christian God? Well, see my videos in that the Christian God is not really analogous to Zeus. And this, I know Sitch has Jewish background, so read Ezekiel Kaufman's book and look at Christine Hayes on the Meta-Divine Realm. That the Christian God, the gods that are the idea of this that's built in, is quite a bit bigger. So it's God number one and God number two. Or you might ask, is Tolkien available to Frodo? Where can Frodo go to find Tolkien? Well, Tolkien's not in Middle-earth, but Tolkien is everywhere in Middle-earth. And that's where you get into some of the difficulties of the Hebrew God. And you think about Jordan Peterson's rehash of Carl Jung. People don't have ideas. Ideas have people. Is Tolkien just an idea, or is Frodo just an idea? Which one is more real? Which one is more real to Frodo? Well, Sauron and the orcs and Mount Doom and Sam and Gandalf might seem very real to Frodo, but less real than Tolkien to us. And this is where we get into, and I got into that in the video too, God as idea versus God as reality. But what do you mean by real? Jordan Peterson helped people appreciate the value of God as idea. Aren't ideas reality? Currently, the big fight between Epic Games and Apple and Google has to do with antitrust, that Apple and Google's app stores, and they resist having other app stores that are available on your iPhone or these other platforms. Well, there's antitrust proceedings. Well, part of what's going on is Epic Games would have an easier time if it weren't the fact that they were selling dollars within Fortnite. Well, what do you mean? Fortnite dollars. They're trying to convert, they're making up Fortnite dollars and selling them for real dollars. Well, how real are dollars? And you very quickly, it gets into the question of whether Fortnite dollars are goods. And if you want to listen to a treatment of this, you can listen to the Vergecast, where I forget his name. The editor of The Verge had his training basically as a trade lawyer. And so Nilay Patel, discusses why this conflict between Epic Games and Apple and Google app stores is important, because now we're at a point where can something I buy within a video game be considered a good? Something analogous to a book I might purchase, when actually we're trading dollars. When I purchase something on Amazon, I'm not taking paper out of my pocket and putting it in an envelope and sending it to Jeff Bezos. I'm clicking and numbers get transferred and the book comes to me. Or if I'm playing Fortnite, Epic doesn't just want to give Apple its 30% on the purchase of Fortnite dollars or whatever currency they're using there. Basically, Epic is saying that these app stores are anti-competitive and they're monopolistic. And they have an argument. And Nilay Patel said it's going to be in the court for like 10 years before they sort this out, and it's going to go to the Supreme Court. Maybe it will. Ideas are powerful realities in this human space. I would argue that in most cases, they're far more powerful than a lot of material realities. Why? We use this word spiritual because it's the thing that moves the world. It's the forms that the materiality conforms to. Look at the causes from Aristotle. They rule over the world and change history. Jordan Peterson's quest to understand the Cold War. Well, why would the United States and the Soviet Union put the world at risk over competing ideas? Yep. That's why he wrote Maps of Meaning. The more powerful human technology becomes, the more powerful these ideas are. And as Jordan Peterson, the point he made, in his biblical series is why do people start believing the Bible after watching this series? Because he practices a sort of mythological concordism. He takes cognitive science, evolutionary psychology, all of these ideas, and relates them to the biblical stories. And people suddenly say, the Bible has credibility again for me. Maybe there's other wisdom in the Bible I can pursue. Maybe there's wisdom in these religious communities that can help me because they relate the oldest and most dominant patterns in the world. And if I actually want to have success moving forward in my life, if I can learn these patterns and learn wisdom, then I can go forward and be more successful in the world. I can get what I want. Symbolic truth correspondence. Now, religious skepticism says, well, will doing these religious things like prayer, rites, imaginative relationships with beings cause the outcomes I desire? And those are usually health, fortune, gratification, fulfillment, eternal life. Not like science. But again, is it really science? Or using science as a metaphor for a degree of certainty? And what you're probably really saying is technology. But most of this technology we're using is pretty short-lived. Human beings last a lot longer than the cell phone that you'll sport for 2 or 3 or 4 years, maybe, if you make the thing last. Remember the issue with historical truth. Most of the kinds of truths we're dealing with can't be reduced in this way. There's a lot of slipperiness here, too, when it comes to wants. What do you really want? Well, I want this. Well, do you? How long do you want that? Well, I thought I wanted that, but I really want this. In fact, the things that you want, you probably have difficulty articulating. I want to be happy all the time. If you're happy all the time but bored, will that satisfy you? No, I want meaning. What will give you meaning? Well, hitting the goal. Well, then you need a goal. Well, how to choose the goal? What is the right goal? Did you get what you wanted from Santa Claus? How long did it satisfy you? And the power that Jordan Peterson notes is that the more powerful we get, the future is so full of people, as is the past. And he makes this point in one of his 5 parts from 2018 on the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The more dominant we get technologically, you could argue that these peoplified construals are more and more powerful. In other words, Uncle Sam grows in power all the time. Santa Claus is more powerful today than he was 500 years ago. Well, because of the commercial industrial complex. Uncle Sam and Santa Claus move the economy. How about believing in climate change? What does it mean to believe in climate change? I believe I'm cooking the world as I get into my car and I drive to the next town. Well, there you go. You believe you're cooking the world. I don't believe I'm cooking the world as you get into your car and drive the next town. Does that belief actually function? Well, I'm going to drive a Prius. Well, good for you. Is it going to make a difference? What do you mean by believe? And then, of course, politics. Now, I talked about cargo cults. And you can check that part of the video. If you build it, they will come. These islanders built, and Byrne has a video about that. The U.S. military swooped in their war against Japan, and they built runways. And, of course, they didn't want to be fighting the natives or killing these people. So, for a small price, they can hand out trinkets and food. And, the people loved getting all this cargo from the U.S. military. And then, of course, as the war moved on, it moved away. And they're like, we want this back. So they build a landing strip and they build a Gilligan's Island plane and a little tower. And maybe if they build these things, they will come. Now, G.K. Chesterton makes the point that, the rational person is very rational, but usually in a very small sphere. Well, these people are being very rational, usually in a very small sphere. And in fact, their cargo cult worked because we're still talking about them. The Prince Philip cult, well, Prince Philip, he hears about these group of islanders that are worshiping him, and at some point, he's traveling around the world. Why don't I go and meet these people who are worshiping me? And when he's going to go and meet them that worship him, what's he going to do? He's going to bring gifts. It works, their little Gilligan's Island airplane and landing strip. It works. You say, oh, that's silly. It doesn't work. Well, what picture did you have in mind to believe in? Did it bring them food? Did it bring them attention? Did it increase their world? Did it make them more wealthy and powerful? Yeah, it did. Islands that didn't do this didn't get the same kind of attention, did they? We're not telling their story. Oh, those silly people. Really? Is it silly? They asked me about Brett Weinstein's Unite 2020. I said, it's a cargo cult. Unity 2020. Anybody expect them to win an election? No. Is it kind of a good idea to mend the polarization? Absolutely. It's sort of a cargo cult. Their constructions indeed won them fame and renown, more money, more visitors, and outside cargo too. So what are we really wanting to know here? We want to know, does religion work? If I do the rituals, if I go to church, if I do these things, would it be worthwhile investing my time in order to what? To be more happy, to be more powerful, to be more successful? In developing belief thinking to the point that I say, I believe in God and it feels authentic to me. In doing these rites and in participating financially and giving my time and talent and money to these communities, will that pay off? Well, secularist scientific evidence about people, in fact, who are involved in religious communities, the answer is very, very clear, and even atheists will acknowledge this. Religious people are happier, wealthier, more generous, even with non-religious charities. They have more children. They are more stable emotionally. They are more communal, and they have a safety net around them that a lot of non-religious people don't have. Religion works. And this is Adam's point again and again. In the long-term Darwinian competition, why are there so many religious people? Why is religion so ubiquitous? Because it works. And from a Darwinian perspective, if it didn't work, you wouldn't find it. And this is from the secularish, materialist perspective. And that puts them in a bind. We can go all the way back to the Greeks, and many of which said, well, I'm really skeptical about Zeus being there on Mount Olympus, but I think this whole mythology is good for the culture. So, you can find deists. You can find George Washington, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson. People were deeply skeptical about these things, but they thought religious is good for the community, and so they would participate at a little level and even give money, which Ben Franklin did. Well, but can you do this for the outcomes only if you don't believe? Well, not really. But now we're back to the Santa Claus status game, because the celebrity atheists in their mockery were basically playing a status game. Ah, you silly people, you still believe in Santa Claus. How foolish. We smart people who are up on the stage, we know better. Oh, okay, it's a little elitist game. Is that what it is? There's some very smart, well-educated, religious people with very nuanced belief that go far beyond that, and they're not hard to find. But you can't just decide one day to believe, because, again, belief is not volitional. It's not subject to I'm just going to believe today. If you want to believe, now we're back to Jonathan Haidt's Elephant and the Rider. If you want to train the elephant, you have to change the path. You have to live into the story. You have to make a commitment to an institution, and what you'll find, C. Everett Koop was one of these people who his wife wanted to go to church, and he loved his wife, and she nagged him, so he went to church, and he didn't believe anything of the sermons, but going Sunday after Sunday, listening to that preacher, began to decide, I don't think this is totally crazy, and I'm starting to believe this stuff. He became a Christian. It's what happens to people. It's why churches keep going. So, if you want to believe something, you have to change who you are around and change what you do and subject yourself to the molding, forming influences, and you'll find yourself believing. And if you find yourself believing, then you'll probably be able to benefit from the kinds of things associated with the practices that surround people who say they believe, no matter how muddy those beliefs get. I'm out of time. There's the end of the video. I've got I should have links to pretty much everything I put in this video, but there's hopefully a little better structured, maybe a little clearer, maybe not, answer to this little debate between Adam and PSA Sitch.